welcome to this very special bulletin focusing on the south of the country, all the news that's been happening here on the COVID front and otherwise as well. And to start with, we'll be looking really at the economic impact of this lockdown, how the state should actually come out of it, with a special focus on the south of the state. And for this, we're very happy to be joined by Professor Chetan Subramanian, who is a faculty with the Economics and Social Sciences area and also Dean Faculty at the prestigious Indian Institute of Management here in Bengaluru. Professor Chetan, thank you so much for joining us. To begin with, of course, every single state has really suffered from the lockdown economically. The South, though, it's a big contributor, isn't it, to India's GDP? What really is the kind of share that the South has when it comes to India's economy?
Thanks, Maya, for having me on. So the southern states roughly contribute about 30% of India's GDP. And more importantly, I think they are one of the largest contributors to the tax revenue. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, all the southern states are in the top 10 in terms of contributions to tax revenue, which means that if the southern states slow down, then, well, it has consequences for the country as a whole.
Yes, absolutely. Tax revenue as well. So everybody interested, not just the South, but everybody interested really in getting the South back in action. Now, are there any specific challenges that face the southern states as compared to other states? Any challenges which are specific to the states here in the south of India?
Yeah, I think each of the southern states has challenges which are kind of unique to itself. So, for example, Karnataka, let me take the case of Karnataka. Karnataka houses about 3.8 million MSMEs. It is one of the states with the largest number of MSMEs in the country. Now, this is a sector that's traditionally suffered from liquidity problems, and that problem has only gotten aggravated because of the COVID crisis. So, for example, this is, of course, a nationwide average, but the average number of receivable days, which is the time it takes from raising an invoice to actually getting paid, has increased from about 6 to 9 months, thanks to the crisis. Now, as a consequence of this, what has happened is about 71% of the MSMEs have not paid wages. And obviously, this has disastrous consequences for the economy. Again, if you look at cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad, they have huge exposure to the IT sector. And about 2/3 of their business comes from, say, the United States and Europe. And with the US and Europe going into a recession, well, these sectors are going to be hit. If you look at Tamil Nadu, for example, they are a manufacturing hub, particularly in the automobile sector, and a large part of their imports actually comes from China. And with China slowing down, that supply chain is going to be hit. You look at Kerala, it depends a lot on tourism, and we all know the consequences of COVID for tourism. Andhra, Telangana, agriculture-heavy states, and when you have transportation lockdowns, you have consequences. All of these states have huge exposure to real estate, and the real estate sector was in trouble going into the crisis. That has only become worse. And, with things like, the migrant labor going back, they have other supply side constraints that come in. So, each of these states faces, unique challenges in that sense.
Huge challenges, like, for example, Karnataka's massive construction industry. And with all the migrants, most of the migrants just wanting to go home, special trains arranged for them, the Karnataka government did, in fact, in between, stop those trains. It's a very, very difficult balance, really, isn't it? Human lives paramount, but their movement is affecting the industry as well. And that is what the Karnataka government seemed to follow at that time, a very difficult balance.
Absolutely. You're bang on right, Maya. It's a huge balancing act that governments have to do. But yeah, that's the situation that we find ourselves in.
And for Bengaluru's IT industry, because of course Karnataka is really a lot about IT, the NASSCOM IT industry has spoken about a very, very graded return to the offices, graded return to work. That must be a massive loss, really, as well, internationally, in terms of international revenue, and also for the state itself.
That's right. But as I just pointed out to you, I think the biggest problem is going to be the fact that about 2/3 of their business comes from the United States and Europe. And these are economies that are tottering at this point of time. The United States, the unemployment rate is probably the highest that it's been since the Great Depression. Europe is no better. Massive job loss, massive retrenchments, companies shutting down, unemployment numbers at record highs. That's going to impact the IT sector in India, for sure.
One final question. Your recommendations, how would you see this delicate balance of opening up the economy, which is essential, but making sure we all stay safe from a massive spike in the number of COVID cases? How would you recommend? What would be your major recommendations?
I think we are already on that path. I mean, you want to first open up sectors where perhaps the contact is not as heavy, and then you take a very measured approach when you start, letting in workers back. Sometimes that's a hard act to actually carry out, easier said than done. But I think, in addition to opening up, you also have to sort of address some of the constraints that I've already spoken about. So, for example, I think you've got to get liquidity into a lot of these sectors. Now, India has a very strange problem at this point. Banks are flush with liquidity, but they're simply not lending it out to the sectors that need it most, for example, the MSMEs. So something has to be done in that context. So maybe online lending platforms. Governments certainly have to provide wage subsidies to the employers so that they can make their wage payments. I also think this is a good opportunity for the government to actually kickstart long-delayed infrastructure projects, because these infrastructure projects typically are the ones that have the highest multiplier, so to speak. In other words, for every rupee that the government spends, the output increases over 2. So these are some of the measures that, for example, the government can do while sort of calibrating the opening up of the economy.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Chetan Subramanian, for that overview really of how the southern states are coping and how they need to cope in future as well.